Hello, how are you this evening? Well, welcome to another evening news, world news prophetic update. And the first thing we have here is Yahoo News. Ebola returns to Liberia. Less than 2 months after Liberia was declared Ebola-free by the World Health Organization, the virus is back in the country. Over the weekend, a 17-year-old boy died in a small town outside the Liberian capital of Monrovia, the New York Times reports. His family had the burial team swab his body to test for the virus. The test came back positive, as did a blood test taken by an Ebola response team on Tuesday. According to the Times, a clinic initially diagnosed the boy with malaria, which has similar symptoms to the early stages of Ebola. Agence France Presse reports that 2 more patients have tested positive for the disease, and according to the WHO's latest situation report, health authorities have identified 102 people who were in contact with the boy, a number that is expected to increase as investigations continue. Even when the outbreak fizzled out in Liberia, neighboring Guinea and Sierra Leone have continued to see 20 to 27 cases a week since late May, according to the WHO. There have been more than 11,000 total deaths from the outbreak since it began in March 2014. Health authorities have identified 102 people who were in contact with the boy, a number that is expected to increase. Right now, it's unclear how the boy got infected. He reportedly had not been to Guinea or Sierra Leone, nor is he thought to have been in contact with anyone visiting from those countries, making it all the more mysterious how the virus found a foothold again in Liberia. The Centers for the Disease Control and Prevention said in a statement that the agency is on the ground with Liberia Ministry of Health and others working to understand the origin of the reported case of Ebola and stopping spread to others. When Ebola first came to Liberia, it overwhelmed the country's thinly spread health system. Only 170 doctors lived in the country before the outbreak, according to the Wall Street Journal, many of whom weren't practicing. Protective equipment was sorely lacking, and a few medical staff had been trained in the basic principles of infection prevention and control, allowing the disease to spread through hospitals and healthcare facilities. West Africa had never seen an outbreak before, and many people were fearful and distrusting of health workers and loath to stop traditional burial practices, which included the washing of dead bodies. Next up, the Shanghai Express reports crater expands, ejection of more smoke and ashes reported. Panic continues to grip Wuhan village. Panic still grips the villagers of Old Wuhan and Ukrula district as smoke and ashes are still gushing out from the swampy Shitru area, with signs of gradual expansion of the crater and developing more holes. According to the villagers, they first sighted smoke emitting from Shitru in the month of April this year. However, they thought that it was coming from the burning pine roots in the forest. However, village youth Wisdom Vasham, who accidentally stepped into the hole, suffered burned injuries on his left leg. The incident made them realize that something unnatural was happening at the area, they said. Shitru is located very closely to Old Wuhan village between the mountain range boundary of Myanmar and Nagaland. Stanhope Vasham, who had visited Shitru, said that 3 holes at the radius of 1 feet are now clearly visible in the surrounding area at the circumference of around 60 feet has sunk due to continuous emission of ashes. Alright, next story. Turkey planning to invade Syria. National Security Council meets to discuss plan to send in troops to set up buffer zone and prevent formation of Kurdish state. Prevent? Turkish soldiers run to their new positions next to the border fence in Akkale, southeastern Turkey. Turkey has sent shockwaves through the Middle East by preparing plans to send troops into Syria for the first time, turning the civil war into an international conflict on Europe's borders. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan had authorized a change in the rules of engagement agreed by the Turkish parliament to allow the army to strike at Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, as well as the Assad regime, according to local newspapers. The aim is to establish a buffer zone for refugees and against ISIL, but Mr. Erdogan has also suggested that the main target of the intervention, if it goes ahead, will be to prevent the emergence of a Kurdish state on Turkey's doorstep. Kurdish forces drive ISIL fighters out of Syrian border town. The Syrian Kurdish militia, the YPG, has established a dominance in a border strip across the north of the country in recent months. We will never allow the establishment of a state in Syria's north and our south, Mr. Erdogan said at the weekend. We will continue our fight in this regard no matter what it costs. Mr. Erdogan heads the National Security Council meeting. Turkey has urged the creation of a buffer zone protected by international forces in the north of Syria ever since the civil war sent hundreds of thousands of refugees across the border. That figure is approaching 2 million, making Turkey the single largest host of refugees of any country. Turkey stumbles in the dark. Where next for its democracy? But until now, it has refused to countenance a going it alone in intervention in Syria. The plans were discussed in a meeting of the National Security Council last night. Following Mr. Erdogan's speech, Turkish media were briefed on new orders being given to the military to prepare to send an 18,000-strong force across the border, with some reports saying the move could take place as early as Friday. The troops would seize a stretch of territory 60 miles long by 20 deep, including the border crossings of Jarablus, currently in ISIL hands, and Azaz, currently controlled by the Free Syrian Army but under attack from ISIL. The buffer zone would kill several birds with one stone, as well as allowing Turkey to establish refugee camps not on its soil but under its protection. It would prevent the two current zones of Kurdish control from Kobani to the Iraq border in the east and Afrin in the west from joining up. The Turkish establishment is hostile to the YPG as an offshoot of the PKK guerrilla group, which has fought for autonomy in southeastern Turkey for 4 decades. The zone would also allow Turkey more easily to control the flow of weapons and fighters into Syria, something that critics say it has not done well enough, encouraging the rise of ISIL. Changing the rules of engagement would give Turkey a pretext for intervention. The Assad regime has been driven back and has been careful to present no threat that would justify an attack, but ISIL is attacking FSA forces supported by Turkey on the border. ISIL, along with other army groups that have potential to jeopardize Turkey's security, will be included as threats to Turkey in the amended rules, and the Turkish armed forces could launch an operation against ISIL once it approaches its borders, the pro-Erdogan Sabah newspaper reported. Turkish army soldiers guard the border area with Syria, as in the background Syrian refugees wait in order to cross into Turkey. It remains unclear whether the threat to intervene will be followed up by action. The military is said to be unhappy to involve ground troops in the civil war. They are said to be offering to join the international bombing campaign against ISIL instead. It may be the government wants to do this, but there are numerous institutional reservations, said Sinan Olgan, head of the Adam think tank in Istanbul. In particular, there is a question mark over whether the intervention would be legal under Turkish law without a vote in parliament, or in international law without a UN Security Council resolution. Turkey accused of allowing Islamic State fighters to cross its border in Kobani attack. There would also be intense opposition to the operation being approved by the Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu, who is only still in place because of difficulties forming a coalition after his party, the Islamist AKP, failed to win a majority in this month's election. The intervention would also be opposed by the rival Republican People's Party, which blames Mr. Erdogan for making the Syrian war worse by supporting Islamist rebels rather than using his influence to negotiate peace. There is not sufficient reason to send Turkish troops to Syria, said Farouk Lagoglu, who until the election was head of the CHP's Foreign Affairs Committee. Once you do that, there is no way out. The Financial Times reported on Monday that Jordan was drawing up similar plans for a safe zone in southern Syria, following concerns that ISIL could take over territory close to its border if the Assad regime was to withdraw from the city of Daraa. Next up, an all-out war south of Israeli-Sinai border. ISIS in Egypt, according to an image it posted on social media. The northern Sinai Peninsula south of the border with Israel is engulfed in an all-out war. Egyptian F-16 warplanes attacked Islamic State and other jihadist positions for several hours Wednesday afternoon and killed more than 90 jihadists following massive ISIS attacks. Most of the 70 Egyptian casualties were soldiers and policemen, and the death toll is not final. Egypt retaliated immediately and fiercely, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said, terrorism is knocking on our borders. ISIS is not only across from the Golan Heights, it is also in Egypt, across from Rafah, and we are together with Egypt and other states in the Middle East and the world in the struggle against extreme Islamic terror. Together or not, Israel immediately closed crossings to Egypt and Gaza. ISIS declared yesterday that it will wipe out both Hamas and Israel. Egypt still is counting the bodies of those who killed today while its jets bombarded jihadi posts near Rafah and at Sheikh Zayed, where ISIS had set siege to a police station earlier in the day. The ISIS attacks may have finally woken up the regime of Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to the fact that ISIS is no less a threat to Cairo than it is to Damascus and Baghdad. ISIS assassinated Egypt's state prosecutor 2 days ago. The terrorist machine gave the world a hint Wednesday morning just how powerful and well-armed it is. Terrorists used anti-tank rockets, assault rifles, and rocket-propelled grenades in the assault on 15 different army and police positions in a well-planned and calculated war on the regime that faces al-Sisi with a bigger threat than even the Muslim Brotherhood, whose party he replaced in a de facto military coup last year. ISIS also has anti-aircraft guns, some of which were destroyed in the Egyptian retaliation this afternoon. Egypt has been in turmoil ever since the Arab Spring protests against Hosni Mubarak, who ousted was hastened by President Barack Obama, who in turn praised the Muslim Brotherhood and its leader Mohammed Morsi following his election. A year later, Obama found himself once again encouraging the ouster of the president and praising Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, whose regime has been no less ruthless than Mubarak's and Morsi's. With the alternative being anarchy, the United States and other powers have backed al-Sisi, but the Sinai has been virtually a province of anarchy for 4 years. Hamas has been a serious threat to Egyptian control in the Sinai next to the border with Israel, and the Gaza terrorist party and army have executed dozens of attacks against Egyptian forces. ISIS making Hamas look like small potatoes. And Arut Sheva says Congress demands Obama step back from Iran nuclear deal. Leading senators urge a pause in negotiations, slam administration official for saying nuclear inspections unnecessary. Leading members of Congress are pressing U.S. President Barack Obama to abandon his attempts to force through a nuclear deal with Iran after the deadline for talks was extended on Tuesday to July 7th in a last gasp week-long reprieve. In response to the desperate efforts to reach a deal despite the obvious differences in position that continue to prevent an agreement from being reached, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican of Kentucky, blasted the Obama administration in an op-ed for Politico. President Obama and Secretary of State Kerry should use the opportunity to pause negotiations, take a step back, and re-examine the point of the talks in the first place, said McConnell. Differences between the two sides are apparent even in terms of the deadline. While the U.S. announced an extension to next Tuesday, Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif said Wednesday, "We did not set any deadline," reports Fox News. Efforts to reach a deal on Iran's nuclear program continue Thursday with an International Atomic Energy Agency chief Yukiya Amano visiting Tehran to try and get Iran to come clean on the military aspects on its nuclear program. Meanwhile, in Vienna, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and Zarif are to be joined by the foreign ministers of France, Germany, Britain, and China for a final push in negotiations. U.S. same as leading state terror sponsor. A key sticking point in the talks has involved Iran's refusal to allow inspectors in to investigate its secretive nuclear facilities. Top Republican senators lashed back after an anonymous administration official on Monday said inspectors shouldn't be able to inspect every military site in Iran because the United States of America wouldn't allow anybody to get into every military site. Senators John McCain, Republican of Arizona, and Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, slammed the comment in a joint statement for its comparison of the U.S. to the leading state sponsor of terrorism. With the Iranian nuclear negotiations in a critical phase, this statement should alarm us all, the two remarked. There is no place in this negotiation for moral equivalence. That thinking was wrong in the Cold War, and it is wrong today. Iran is not like any other nation. Least of all, the United States. Iran has a proven record of cheating on its nuclear program. House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Ed Royce also condemned the administration's stance, saying the standard needs to go anywhere, anytime, not go some places, sometimes. Congress will have 30 days or 60 if a deal is reached after July 9th to review any nuclear deal and can vote to block the sanctions relief. However, experts have warned that the current sanctions regime against Iran has not been tough enough in allowing the Iranian GDP to grow 3% in 2014, gross domestic product. Just this Monday, Iranian officials announced that 13 tons of gold had been repatriated as part of sanctions relief, bringing the total in unfrozen assets since the November 2013 interim deal was signed to just under $12 billion. Senior Iranian officials have gone on record saying that Islamic regime will use advanced centrifuges after a deal is signed, a move which would allow it to obtain nuclear arsenal within weeks. Wow. Analysis: Egypt is losing its war against ISIS in the Sinai. Wednesday's deadly attacks in Sinai raised difficult questions about the Egyptian army operation on intel capabilities, but Sisi resolve is unlikely to weaken. Wednesday's terror attack was the largest ever carried out by the Sinai province, Islamic State's Egyptian affiliate, since it began its fight against the government in Cairo some 4 years ago. It also marked the most painful blow suffered by the Egyptian military in its war on extremist Islamist terror, which it is bent on eradicating. It was a well-planned attack carried out by dozens of ISIS operatives in northern Sinai, and the explosions and weapons fire were heard loud and clear in Israel. Amid concerns that ISIS may try to spread their attacks in the direction of Israel, and in the past there has been several instances that started with clashes with the Egyptian army in Sinai and ended in infiltrations into Israel. The IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, decided to raise its preparedness along the border and to close the Karim Shalom and Nassano border crossings. The crossings were reopened on Thursday. Egypt has deployed fighter jets against the North Sinai terrorists as the country faces its toughest battle in the region since the 1973 Yom Kippur War with Israel. Wednesday's events prove that despite the regime of Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's steadfastness in directing the Egyptian army and security forces to use unyielding power against the terror organization, the task has proven difficult and is exacting a heavy price. The honest truth as of now is that Egypt is not succeeding in its war on terror. This raises difficult questions about the Egyptian Army's operational capabilities, its lack of sufficient intel gathering abilities, and perhaps even worse, its helplessness and negligence. The ISIS-affiliated Sinai province is an incarnation of a previous organization, Ansar Bait al-Maqdis, which once identified itself as a local arm of al-Qaeda, and from time to time carried out operations against Israel as a subcontractor of Hamas. A few months ago, the group abandoned al-Qaeda and pledged allegiance to ISIS in exchange for a promise of financial aid. It will be interesting to see how the situation in Sinai will influence Egypt's relations with Hamas. After hatred and acrimony between Hamas and Cairo, the height of which was seen during last summer's Operation Protective Edge, and accusations that Hamas aided terrorists in Sinai in recent weeks, there has been signs of better relations between Gaza and Egypt. All right, I'm going to let you pause and read the rest here. Another eruption, reporting from Wired.com. Update: quake swarms hit Iceland, Japan rumbles. Steam rises from a slope near the hot springs resort of Hakone, Kanagawa Prefecture on June 30th, 2015. Japan's meteorological agency on June 30th raised a volcanic warning for the popular hot springs resort of Hakone by 1 notch. Earlier this spring, the area around Hakone had deemed too dangerous for the tourists who usually frequent the area due to increased seismicity and deformation of the volcano near Tokyo. Yesterday, Hakone experienced a small explosion that could be a precursor of more eruptive activity or merely heating up of hydrothermal system. This explosion was likely a steam-driven phreatic explosion caused by water heating up to the point of boiling in the upper parts of the Hakone's hydrothermal system. A landslide accompanied the explosion, although it is unclear whether it preceded or followed the event. You can check out some video of the event that had the explosion, along with some of the debris that it produced. It looks to be still vigorously emitting volcanic gas and steam. The Japanese Meteorological Agency raised the alert status at Hakone to level 3 after yesterday's explosion, and the evacuation radius was increased to 1 kilometer from the central area of Hakone. As you scroll down here, it says in Guatemala, eruptions at Fuego in Guatemala as well. Amazing. And now we have a 5.8 magnitude earthquake strikes off the Solomon Islands. Early Thursday, U.S. geologists said, but there was no initial reports of damage and no tsunami warnings were issued. The quake hit a depth of 8.9 kilometers or 5.6 miles deep and 92 kilometers from Kirakira and 334 kilometers from the capital Honiara. Excuse my pronunciation. In 2013, the Solomons were hit by a tsunami after an 8.0 magnitude quake, leaving at least 10 people dead and thousands homeless after buildings were destroyed. And again, the Telegraph reports unprecedented wave of shark attacks caused terror in North Carolina. 7 people have been bitten since June, but wildlife experts say it is down to several different sharks and is not a Jaws situation. A 7th person in North Carolina has been bitten by sharks in what is becoming an unprecedented wave of attacks on tourist beaches. The 68-year-old man was flown to hospital after being bitten on his hands and leg as he swam off the shore of Ocracoke Island. He is the 7th person attacked. The spate of attacks began last month when a teenage girl escaped with only minor injuries and damage to her surfboard. Wow. Emergency responders assist a teenage girl at the scene of a shark attack in Oak Island, North Carolina. How sad. This is awful. Pray for this lady and the 68-year-old man. But it escalated on June 14 when 16-year-old Hunter Treschel has had his left arm bitten off. I thought it felt like a big fish and I started moving away, and then the shark bit my arm off, he said. Testicle munching fish species found in U.S. lake. An hour later, 12-year-old girl also lost her left arm in a separate attack a few miles away. Since then, a small boy, 18-year-old male, and a grown man have all suffered injuries. Wednesday's attack occurred shortly after noon as the man swam around 25 feet off the beach. It is not clear how badly he was injured. So far, no one has been killed in this summer's attacks. George Burgess, director of the Florida Program for Shark Research, said the bites were unlikely to be the work of a single animal. This isn't a Jaws situation. The more serious injuries were probably caused by tiger sharks, which can grow up to 16 feet, or the slightly smaller bull shark. The less grievous wounds may have been the work of a black tip or a spinner. Mr. Burgess said that hotter than usual summer temperatures had made the water warmer and saltier, two factors that encourage sharks to enter. Large groups of herring, a favorite food for sharks, have also been found off the North Carolina coast, and the sharks likely followed them. Hot temperatures have also lured beachgoers in larger numbers than usual, increasing the likelihood of a shark-human encounter. You have an unholy mix of sharks and humans in greater concentrations, plus lots of bait fishes, Mr. Burgess said. Lifeguard captures sharks lurking in shallow water on a Florida beach. He added that while most smaller sharks are unlikely to target humans, some of the larger fish would see people as prey. A human being is an appropriate sized food item in the eyes of a larger shark. Mr. Burgess said it would be difficult to figure out which shark was responsible for each attack, and discouraged fishermen from trying to hunt down the animals. That would be nothing more than an exercise in revenge. And from the Telegraph, U.S. blocks attempts by Arab allies to fly heavy weapons directly to Kurds to fight Islamic State. Wow. Middle East allies accuse Barack Obama and David Cameron of failing to show strategic leadership in fight against ISIL, as MPs could be given vote on whether to bomb Syria. Thanks a lot, Mr. Obama. Scum dictator. The United States has blocked attempts by its Middle East allies to fly heavy weapons directly to the Kurds fighting Islamic State jihadists in Iraq, the Telegraph has learnt. Some of America's closest allies say President Barack Obama and other Western leaders, including David Cameron, are failing to show strategic leadership. How about showing dictatorship and encouraging Islamic State to continue? They now say they are willing to go it alone in supplying heavy weapons to the Kurds, even if means defying the Iraqi authorities and their American backers, who demand all weapons to be channeled through Baghdad. Boy, Obama's just making an enemy out of every nation in the world, isn't he? High-level officials from Gulf and other states have told this newspaper that all attempts to persuade Mr. Obama of the need to arm the Kurds directly as part of more vigorous plans to take on Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant have failed. The Senate voted down one attempt by supporters of the Kurdish cause last month. The officials say they are looking at the new ways to take the fight to ISIL without seeking U.S. approval. West is losing Twitter battle with fanatics, says General Allison Pearson. We should demand military action against Islamic State. If the Americans in the West are not prepared to do anything serious about defeating ISIL, then we will have to find new ways of dealing with the threat, said a senior Arab government official. With ISIL making ground all the time, we simply cannot afford to wait for Washington to wake up to the enormity of the threat we face. The Peshmerga have been successfully fighting ISIL, driving them back from the gates of Erbil, and with the support of Kurds from neighboring Syria, re-establishing control over parts of Iraq's northwest. But they are doing so with a makeshift armory. Millions of pounds worth of weapons have been bought by a number of European countries to arm the Kurds, but American commanders who are overseeing all military operations against ISIL are blocking the arms transfers. One of the core complaints of the Kurds is that the Iraqi army has abandoned so many weapons in the face of ISIL attack that the Peshmerga are fighting modern American weaponry with out-of-date Soviet equipment. At least one Arab state is understood to be considering arming the Peshmerga directly despite U.S. opposition. The U.S. has also infuriated its allies, particularly Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the Gulf states by what they perceive to be a lack of clear purpose and vacillation in how they conduct the bombing campaign. Other members of the coalition say they have identified clear ISIL targets but then been blocked by U.S. veto from firing at them. There is simply no strategic approach, one senior Gulf official said. There is a lack of coordination in selecting targets and there is no overall plan for defeating ISIL. Britain is moving closer to expanding its role in the war. The government on Wednesday gave its strongest indication yet that MPs will be given a new vote on whether to bomb ISIL in Syria. Michael Fallon, the defense secretary, said it was illogical that British planes were able to hit extremists in Iraq but not across the border. So the New World Order, through Obama and Britain, is trying to stop or let ISIL continue and grow. Any decision to bomb in Syria would have to be approved by MPs. In 2013, the Prime Minister lost a vote for British military action in Syria. However, Mr. Fallon said, "It is a new parliament and I think new members of parliament will want to think very carefully about how we best deal with ISIL and the illogicality of ISIL not respecting the border lines." Mr. Fallon suggested that a bombing campaign could be mounted in revenge for the terror attacks in Tunisia if a link could be proved between the killer and ISIL in Libya. Britain would only take military action in Libya where we think there's an imminent threat, a very direct to British lives or, for example, to British hostages, he said. Next up, from CBS of San Francisco Bay Area, world's Jewish population approaching pre-Holocaust numbers. Picture taken in May 1941 showing foreign Jews, mainly Polish Jews, getting off the SNCF train in Pithiviers Center, France. According to the October 1940 anti-Jewish law and under German pressure, more than 3,000 of them were arrested by the Paris police headquarters and imprisoned in the transit camps of Pithiviers at, I'm not going to pronounce that. The world's Jewish population has almost rebounded to pre-Holocaust numbers, according to the new report. The Jewish People Policy Institute, JPPI, estimates there are currently 4.2 million Jewish people in the world today. That estimate approaches 16.2 million, the number of Jewish people in the world before World War II, when Nazis and their collaborators killed 6.1 million Jews. The JPPI credits high fertility rates and natural growth in Israel for the increase. California is home to 1.2 million Jews, according to the American-Israeli Cooperative Enterprise. The JPPI's report presented to the Israeli cabinet on Sunday casts a wide net. The tally includes people who consider themselves Jewish, others with at least one Jewish parent, Israelis who immigrated from the former Soviet Union, and 1 million secular Jews who have no connection to Jewish life or institution. In contrast, a report by the Pew Research Center that only includes people who self-identify as Jews say the Jewish population will not reach 16 million until 2050. And BBC News reports again, Egypt's Sinai operations will last until ISIS is removed. Egypt has vowed to rid its Sinai Peninsula of militants after major clashes with Islamic State fighters there killed more than 100 people. Alright, well, I'll let you read the rest of this, and I'll pause it here, and you can read it. There's a picture here. ISIS militants unleashed a series of attacks, including car bombings on Wednesday. And you can read this. Pause. And down here. And down here. And My Way is reporting my latest Muslim Brotherhood calls for Egypt rebellion. The latest news on the 9 Muslim Brotherhood leaders killed in a Cairo apartment raid. Muslim Brotherhood says its leader killed in a Cairo apartment were murdered in cold blood, calling for a rebellion against President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who calls a butcher. Come out in rebellion and in defense of your country, yourselves and your children, it said in a statement issued in English Wednesday. Destroy the citadels of his oppression and tyranny and reclaim Egypt once more. It called the killings a turning point that will have its own repercussions. El-Sisi is initiating a new phase during which it will not be possible to control the anger of the oppressed sectors who will not accept to be killed in their own houses and in the middle of their families. It says the men were from a brotherhood committee that supports the families of the group's detainees and martyrs and were rounded up inside the house and then were murdered in cold blood without any investigations or indictments. The Interior Ministry says the 9 people killed in a raid on a Cairo apartment were fugitive Muslim Brotherhood leaders who had been meeting to plan terrorist plots. It says the group included 2 people who had previously been sentenced to death. A statement from the ministry late Wednesday said that in addition to weapons, investigators found 43,000 Egyptian pounds, along with documents and memory cards. The ministry said the group was planning attacks on the army, police, judiciary, and media. Materials seized in the raid would be used in the investigation of the assassination of Chief Prosecutor Hisham Barakat, who was killed Monday. The ministry said 3 members of the Special Forces team involved in the raid were wounded in the operation. State television aired images of the apartment after the raid showing bloodied bodies on the floor with several Kalashnikov assault rifles nearby. Egyptian security officials said 64 soldiers have been killed fighting militants in the northern Sinai in the deadliest battle on the peninsula since the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. And the rest of that is about the war between ISIS and Egypt. Breaking Israel news: oppose gay marriage but avoid 2 big mistakes. I attended a wedding on Saturday and then a wedding shower later that same evening. Both events were of the traditional variety, a qualifier which is now required after the U.S. Supreme Court decided to legalize gay marriage nationwide last Friday by a 5-4 decision. This means the United States has surpassed all 20 previous nations as the largest gay marriage supporting nation. Yes, the United States is the most abominable nation in the world now, according to God. Yes, these 21 national decisions are wrong. Yes, they mark a frightening escalation of sin in our time. Yes, they twist God's definition of marriage as the uniting of one man with one woman. And just like the U.S. legalization of abortion in 1973, this newest decision has occurred in a Sabbath rest year, a year of spiritual significance that was designed by God for restoration and renewal, for setting things right, not a year to invent new forms of social rebellion against the Almighty. For me, the timing of Friday's decision seems eerily like a divine setup for some kind of a God-ordained response this fall. To me, the U.S. decision feels also like a capstone for the gay marriage arch, echoing God's words to Abraham in Genesis 15 about the Amorite. Is God telling us that the iniquity of our nation is now complete? But God's response is not the primary aim of this particular column. For more on God's response, I refer you to the Pure Gold course I am teaching on Root Source, on the Blood Moons and More channel. Instead, here and now, I would like to warn you about the 2 biggest traps I see for those of us who oppose gay marriage. Let us not make these 2 mistakes in the midst of our opposition. The first mistake is in seeing those who practice gay marriage as the them in an us versus them comparison. It is too easy for us to separate ourselves emotionally from our fellow human beings and point fingers in judgment, as if we were righteous calling out the unrighteous. This attitude is exactly the problem I have with Islamic opposition of homosexuality. It comes from precisely the wrong motive. The spirit behind Islam is one that is always looking to separate people into groups, those who submit to Islam and survive, and those who do not submit and are punished. We must shun this attitude entirely. The reason Bible-believing Christians and Jews should oppose gay marriage is that according to our understanding of God's ways, gay marriage will not bring them the desired result they seek. As though those who love life, we desire good for all human beings, but we see no good coming out of it for them. The divine blessing and protection of God-defined covenant relationship is simply not possible outside of God's definition. The gay marriage fabrication is even worse than a cheap covenantal substitute. We say the result will be worse for them than if there was no gay marriage at all. Yes, we also believe the result will be worse for all of our society too, but we are not asking them to make sacrifices for the sake of a society as a whole, but for their own well-being in particular. It is not because of hate, but because of reality that we are compelled to warn those who get married that your new house is no house at all. It has no roof, no doors, no windows, no walls, and it is built over a sinkhole. If this new structure you have created brings you life and prosperity, then the God who spoke through Moses in Deuteronomy 30 is a heartless liar. But he is not a liar. What he asks of mankind, he asks in love, and love cannot lie. The second mistake we can make is to overemphasize the importance of Friday's gay marriage decision. Our nation does not have a gay marriage problem. Our nation has a sexual sin problem. Much of our national economic engine runs on the feeding of these sexual appetites internally as well as beyond our borders. Whether it is how we look, what we wear, or what media we look upon and listen to, and all the gadgets and internet and satellite services that make this possible, the engine is there to feed us and to make a profit in the process. Gay marriage is a logical outcome of a larger sexual sin that is absolutely massive in scope and reach within our society. To view gay marriage as the root of the problem is hypocrisy. Do you remember 40 years ago when the national debate was about whether sex should be considered legitimate among just married adults, or loosening up a bit among engaged couples, or loosening up further to those who have least love each other, or in the final loosening of the day among mutually consenting adults? Within 20 years of the approval of the pill in the early 60s, our nation answered that question with a hearty yes to a choice number that of mutually consenting adults. That yes was a milestone on the same sexual highway upon which our nation is still driving, the same sexual highway which gave us Friday's latest yes. And the two-person gay marriage milestone is certainly not the last potential milestone ahead of us. We may not have anything to do with gay marriage personally, but we all have something to do with the sexual sin highway in our various nations. The industry offers us so many ways to participate, by feeding the economic engine to mental fantasy to pornography, and with various forms of sex. We are all guilty of a certain measure of silence. In our failure, speak out loudly to define love, sex, and pleasure in the context of God's wonderful redemptive plan. So yes, we can and should oppose gay marriage, but let us not make two mistakes in the process. First, there is no us and them. We oppose gay marriage because we care for the well-being of everyone involved. And second, we acknowledge our part in the larger sexual problem of our nation and humbly pray that God might have mercy upon us all, allowing us to find an exit ramp off the highway of sexual sin. And reporting from Yahoo News, U.S. warns of Russia, China military threat amid growing chaos. From Washington, America's new military strategy singles out states like China and Russia as aggressive and threatening to U.S. security interests, while warning of growing technological challenges and worsening global stability. A somber report released Wednesday by General Martin Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs, warns of a low but growing probability of the United States fighting a war with a major power with immense consequences. Russia has repeatedly demonstrated that it does not respect the sovereignty of its neighbors, and it is willing to use force to achieve its goals, the 2015 National Military Strategy says. Russia's military actions are undermining regional security directly and through proxy forces. It points to Russian troop presence in the Ukraine conflict, though Moscow denies it has deployed its military in eastern Ukraine to bolster a separatist insurgency. And the report expresses concern about states developing advanced technological capabilities that are causing the U.S. military to lose its edge in that field. When applied to military systems, this diffusion of technology is challenging competitive advantages long held by the United States, such as early warning and precision strike, the paper says. Here, the U.S. Army during a joint military drill at Novo Selo military ground in Bulgaria, June 25th. In addition to China and Russia, the paper also includes Iran and North Korea, highlighting their nuclear and ballistic missile capabilities in a list of countries that pose serious security concerns to America and its allies. Since the last national military strategy was published 4 years ago, global disorder has trended upward while some of our comparative advantages have begun to erode, Dempsey told reporters. The 2011 report spoke little of Russia. China's actions are adding tension to the Asia-Pacific region, the document states, in reference to China's land reclamation efforts to build islands in the contested South China Sea to boost its military and civilian presence. America's enormous military has an annual budget of about $600 billion, dwarfing that of any other nation. And faced with non-state adversaries like the self-proclaimed Islamic State group that has seized significant portions of Iraq and Syria, Dempsey warned of long and complex fights ahead. Future conflicts will come more rapidly, last longer, and take place on a much more technically challenging battlefield, he wrote in the foreword to the report. Violent extremist groups pose an immediate threat to trans-regional security by coupling readily available technologies with extremist ideologies, the report states. And the last bit of news for the day. ECB will not increase liquidity lifeline to Greek banks, source. Man withdraws euros at an ATM machine in Thessaloniki. Athens, AFP, the European Central Bank's Governing Council on Wednesday decided not to increase the liquidity lifeline to cash-strapped Greek banks, a Greek banking source said. The bank is ready to intervene as and when necessary, the source said, adding that no other decision was taken at the ECB meeting. The decision means the bank is keeping open its emergency liquidity assistance program for Greece, but the amount of emergency funding the country's banks can access will remain frozen at around 89 billion euros. It was the ECB's decision on Sunday to refuse to increase emergency funding for Greek banks that pushed Athens to keep its banks closed for a week and limit cash withdrawals to 60 euros per day. Wednesday's meeting with the Frankfurt-based bank's first since bailout talks between Athens and its international lenders collapsed at the weekend, and the government announced a referendum on creditors' latest cash for reform proposals. The debt crisis deepened on Tuesday when Greece's international bailout officially expired and the country failed to make a key IMF debt payment, becoming the first industrialized nation to do so and heightening fears Greece was headed for a Eurozone exit. The ELA program was originally intended as a lifeline for solvent leaders that get into a cash jam, but has become a tool to keep the entire Greek economy alive as Athens, its creditors, wrangle over a new debt deal. Okay, folks, that's going to be all for tonight. May the Lord bless you, keep you safe. Good night.